You kept that mule Corferin. Russ kept his kin friends. The lion kept Leather. Humans, brothers and foster fathers, saved and raised into legion ranks. But not me. Not Angron, no. Did the Emperor teleport his gold-wrapped custodians down to help me and my army? No. Did he free the war hounds and order them to battle, fight alongside me? No. Did he save my brothers and sisters the way he spared and honored the lion's closest kin? The way he honored Corferin? No, no and no. No mercy for Angron. Angron the Oathbreaker. Angron the Betrayer.
Angron, sometimes called the Red Angel and originally named Angronius of Nuceria, the Lord of the Red Sands, is the Primarch of the World Eater's Traitor Legion. He was the most bloody-handed and savage of the Primarchs. When Horus began his rebellion against the Emperor, Angron was quick to join in his treachery because of his long-lasting grudge against the Master of Mankind for the Emperor's failure to rescue his beloved fellow gladiators from death on Nuceria. But his only true master was the rage and bloodlust within him. He fell to chaos during the Post-Heresy and was transformed into a demon prince of the blood god Khorne in the campaign known as the Shadow Crusade before that conflict had ended. He was most recently banished to the Warp after he unleashed the First War of Armageddon upon the Imperium of Man in 474. M41, though, since the opening of the Great Rift in the era Indomitus, rumors have swirled that he is active once more in real space. Kept within the deepest dungeon of the library, Sanctus on Terra, is a tome known as the Liber Malum, whose blood-stained pages record the fate of those who have trod the path to damnation. To even mention its name is to risk madness. Many are the blasphemous heretics and tyrants whose names sully the pages with their treacheries, but foremost amongst these damned souls is Angron, the Primarch of the traitorous World Eater Space Marine Legion. Much of the legend of Angron is incomplete, and there is much that is not known or remains so shrouded in dark legend that the true facts are impossible to discern. A very great deal about the life story of the demon Primarch Angron remains unknown to the wider imperial record. During the scattering of the Primarch's gestation capsules from the Emperor of Mankind's gene laboratories deep beneath the Himalayan mountains, Angron was cast through the warp to a civilized human world far from Terra. How Angron came to be separated from the Emperor so soon after his creation and the name of the planet he eventually came to call home was removed from the imperial record. Indeed, where this planet was, or even if it still exists, is often uncertain to the imperial savants of the present time. There is in fact evidence that this information, including the true name of the world he was found upon, was known but was kept deliberately secret by command of the Emperor and those close to him. The truth is a dark tale of the Primarch's brutal upbringing, murderous violence, and Angron's revolt against his cruel masters. After Angron came to be separated from the Emperor and Terra by the mysterious machinations of the ruinous powers, he was deposited through the warp on the world of Nuceria. Where this planet is located in the galaxy, or if it even still exists, is uncertain, though most signs seem to point to somewhere in the Ultima Segmentum. Carpinus's Speculum Historiale speaks of Angron's world as technologically advanced and ruled over by a wealthy elite who lived in decadent opulence, while the populace of their cities lived in abject poverty in the slums that surrounded their walled palaces and villas. To distract the populace from their poverty, the oligarchic rulers of Nuceria held regular gladiatorial death matches in massive arenas, using cybernetically enhanced gladiators who battled to satisfy the endless bloodlust of the oppressed people. It was on this world that Primarch Angron was eventually discovered, though little else about the circumstances of how he came to be there remains known. After his arrival, Angron was discovered by a slaver who chanced upon the battered and bleeding figure of the young Primarch, surrounded by scores of alien corpses high in the northern Deshelica Mountains. History does not record what species these aliens belonged to, but many Imperial scholars believe them to have been Aeldari who attempted to kill the Primarch due to some psychic foreknowledge of the plague upon the galaxy he would one day become. The young Angron had been badly wounded in the combat, but remained alive. Taken as a slave by the planet's ruling masters, known as the High Riders, the young boy was brought to the Palace Praxica, the seat of the Rexium throne of the powerful Nucerian city-state of Decimation, where he was sold to the ruling clan House Thalkur. Still a frightened young child, he was subsequently dumped into a pit consisting of a single ziggurat with hundreds of other slaves. Acid filled the pit, and to the cheers of the spectators, Angron was eventually forced to kill all around him to remain standing upon the ziggurat's uppermost platform and survive. Shedding a tear for the last time, Angron was proclaimed a promising newcomer to Deshi's arena combat. With the youth's obvious potential as a gladiator apparent, he was bought by the largest and most popular arena in the capital. The Primarch was given a name, Angron Thalkir, which meant Child of the Mountain, and was nursed back to health. The young Primarch quickly grew to a formidable size and was forced to take part in the gladiatorial games of Nuceria. After only a few solar months, Angron Thalkir had become a proud warrior of fearsome skill and an even stronger sense of honor, known to the crowds as the Lord of the Red Sands. He killed hundreds of other gladiators, but those who fought well he always spared. Reaping many victories, Angron soon became a fan favorite of Decimation and came to be known as the Unbeaten. Although he seemed to enjoy the life of a gladiator and the adulation of the Decian crowds, Angron secretly resented his slavery and was always plotting to escape. He proved to be a troublesome champion, prone to escape attempts whenever he saw an occasion, but such efforts always failed. During this time, Angron was mentored by an older gladiator named Indomitus, who formed a deep bond with the younger gladiator and became somewhat of a father figure to the impressionable warrior. Together, the two formidable warriors slew a deadly tally in the gladiatorial arenas of Nuceria, which culminated in an astounding victory against a pair of berserk Ogryn that were surgically equipped with the deadly cybernetic implants known as the Butcher's Nails. Their momentous victory, however, proved short-lived as the High Riders demanded that the two gladiators fight one another in a duel to the death. The fiery Angron refused and openly insulted his Nucerian masters. This resulted in Angron having the Butcher's Nails implanted as a form of punishment. These crude neural implants were hammered into the Primarch's skull and surgically grafted to his cerebral cortex. Relic devices from the dark age of technology, these cortical implants artificially boosted a warrior's adrenaline, resulting in greater strength and aggression in battle. However, they bleached a warrior's mind of all reason, all caution, all the instincts of mortality. The nails rewarded rage with spurts of electrochemical pleasure, tingling synapses and deadening enjoyment of everything else. No better machine for slaughter had ever been contrived by the minds of men. The cells below the massive arena were home to several thousand gladiators, all implanted with the Butcher's Nails, and Angron would soon take his place amongst them. Following the successful surgery, Angron was loosed upon Indomitus and tore apart his friend in a blind, berserk frenzy. Upon regaining his senses, Angron realized the horrible transgression he had committed against his mentor and was driven to such depths of despair that it was said that he unleashed a bestial howl that lasted for several solar days. The death of Indomitus proved to be too much for Angron to bear, and he swore that one day he would make good his escape and make all the High Riders pay dearly. Within a few standard years, Angron's fame had spread to every corner of his homeworld. Under his training, the gladiators of his arena soon became the greatest their world had ever seen, and none could stand against them. Yet Angron also learned, following a final failed escape attempt, that he would never succeed alone. His unbending warrior's code and sheer combat skill had made him a well-respected leader amongst the other Decian gladiators, and when the largest death games ever held on Nuceria were announced, Angron planned his most daring escape attempt. For these new games, Angron was allowed to stage a vast combat that would involve every gladiator of his arena. As the Decian crowd drowned out the sounds of battle, Angron's gladiators turned on their armed guards, butchering them and fighting their way to freedom. Against the guards armed with firearms, the gladiators' casualties were grievous, but nearly 2,000 survived to escape into the streets of Decimation, stealing what weapons and supplies they could before fleeing into the northern mountains where Angron had first been discovered. Over the next few years, the rulers of the world dispatched many armed forces to kill or recapture the rebel slaves, who soon named themselves the Eaters of Cities, but all were destroyed in turn by Angron's leadership, martial skill, and the cybernetically enhanced fury of the gladiators. But attrition and hunger slowly took their toll on the slaves, and eventually only 1,000 men and women remained, half the size of the original force of escapees. On a mountain named Fedan Emehor, on a bleak spit of land known as Decimation Ridge, Angron and his forces were finally surrounded by no less than 7 large Nucerian armies. Not even a Primarch could stand against such sheer numbers, yet it was at this time that the Emperor of Mankind came to Nuceria, drawn by the psychic emanations of his gene son, the Primarch. The Emperor had observed Angron secretly from orbit for many solar months, and had watched with pride as he had led his freed slaves in battle against the forces of tyranny. The Emperor and a small cadre of Legio Custodes descended to the world's surface, and after the shock of the August meeting had worn off on the Primarch, the Emperor offered Angron the leadership of the Dordi Decimith Space Marine Legion, the Warhounds, which had been created from Angron's own genetic material, and a place at his side in the Great Crusade. To the Emperor's disbelief, Angron refused, claiming that his place remained with his fellow slaves amongst the Eaters of Cities, and he would die before deserting them. Reluctantly, the Emperor teleported back to his flagship, shocked at his son's refusal. Appraising the situation, the Emperor saw that for all of Angron's might as a Primarch and a leader, he would die in the coming battle. Losing one of his irreplaceable sons to the assault of rabble on a backwater planet soon to be brought into imperial compliance was simply unacceptable. Bringing his flagship into low orbit over the world, the Emperor teleported Angron from the surface against his will, away from the mountain of Fedan Emehor and the Battle of Decimation Ridge. Without their leader, the morale of the gladiators was destroyed, and the next day they were slaughtered to the last warrior by the armies of Nuceria's rulers. Angron watched helplessly from orbit as his brothers and sisters were quickly annihilated. Sensing his uncontrolled rage, the custodians surrounded Angron, their guardian spears pointed menacingly at the smoldering Primarch. In a fit of sudden violence, Angron killed one of the custodians, but the Emperor intervened, and the Primarch was forced into a state of submission by the Emperor's potent psychic abilities. Angron angrily asked his father why he had not intervened to save the lives of his comrades on the planet below, but the Emperor dismissed the question as lacking vision. He was the Emperor of Mankind, and he possessed a much grander vision for human life, such as reuniting the galaxy on behalf of all humanity. He had little concern for a small group of former slaves battling a group of petty tyrants on a backwater world. The Emperor expressed his hope that, in time, Angron would come to understand his actions and why he had done what he did. Angron replied that he had been meant to die alongside his comrades on Nuceria, and now only a ghost remained. The Emperor replied that a ghost would suffice for what he had planned for his son. Allowing his fellow gladiators to die was a deed Angron would never forgive the Emperor for, and a stain upon the Primarch's honor that would never fade, but fester into a soul-deep wound. The exact records of the Emperor's intervention and Angron's acceptance of his new circumstances is a matter of shadowed rumor and conjecture, but what can be said with certainty is that Angron's first reaction to his new life was simple rage. For some time, any warhound of his legion who came before their Primarch was met with a grisly death for their efforts. At this time, the Legion Master of the Warhounds, Ibram Greer, a respected leader who had commanded the Thortemith Legion for nearly 3 solar decades, disappeared without explanation from any records of the period, and no explanation was given by his taciturn legion for his absence. Only after murdering at least 7 high-ranking officers within the legion, including Greer, Captain Karn of the 8th Assault Company, voluntarily went forth to Angron's private quarters to confront the always enraged Primarch. Nearly beaten to death for his efforts, Karn's unwillingness to accept defeat, even at the hands of a much superior foe, finally convinced Angron of his legion's worthiness and honor as fellow warriors, and he assumed his place as the rightful general and commander of the 14th Legion. Karn managed to form a rapport with Angron, talking about the rituals of Angron's gladiators and the traditions of the warhounds, and showing how similar they were to each other. With Karn's actions convincing him of the worthiness of his Astartes to become his new band of warriors, Angron finally and swiftly took charge of the 14th Legion. The Primarch renamed the Warhounds the World Eaters after he assumed command. Angron did this in part to honor the gladiator force he had led in rebellion on his homeworld, whose warriors had been known as the Eaters of Cities for their wrath and violence. He chose the new name for his legion when Dregger, a Terran-born Warhounds legionary who served as captain of the legion's 9th Company, promised Angron after meeting his Primarch for the first time that under his leadership the Warhounds would become the Eaters of Worlds. Soon after, the newly renamed World Eaters were influenced by Angron's own thirst for battle. During the course of the Great Crusade, Angron and the World Eaters reaped many victories, although some criticized the extreme and bloodthirsty tactics the Red Angel used to ensure the destruction of his opponents. After Angron was teleported away by the Emperor from Nuceria, he was later examined aboard the Warhound's flagship Adamant Resolve's Apothecarian by Vel Caradar, the Archmagos Veneratus of the 38th Legion and a representative of Kelbor Hal, the Fabricator General of the Mechanicum of Mars. After ordering the Devinith Legion's Tech Marines and Apothecaries away, the Primarch was rendered somnolent by the psychic touch of Malkador the Sigillite. Vel Caradar examined the Nucerian Archaeotech neural implants hammered into the Primarch's skull over the course of 7 solar hours, all under the Sigillite's watchful eyes. The Archmagos discovered that the Butcher's nails had remapped Angron's brain after the device's implantation. When the nails activated, they reduced the production of the neurotransmitter known as serotonin in the subject's brain to encourage instinctive aggression, just as they deadened emotional responses and electrical activity to any other portion of the brain save for that which regulated the flow of adrenaline. Unfortunately, the malignant Archaeotech device had not been designed for the biological complexity of a Primarch's brain, as it eroded mental stability and slowly damaged the subject's capacity to reason. The implants also impinged on higher brain function by rewriting emotional responses. To make matters worse, removing the Butcher's nails would only result in the death of the Primarch by destroying his central nervous system. Over time, the Butcher's nails would cause rapid cortical degeneration and eventually kill the Primarch. This was a certainty, though Angron's transhuman physiology would continue to try to heal the damage as the nails bit deeper. Vel Caradar did not know how long it would take the nails to kill the Primarch based on the little data available, but he made an educated estimate. The Archmagos reported these findings to the Emperor and soon received a marked and sealed scroll with the Palatine Aquila upon it, handed to him by the Sigillite himself. It was a message from the Emperor's own hand. He ordered the Archmagos to sequester his findings and to remain silent about what he had discovered. At this time, the 15th Legion was in terrible shape, as they had been one of the last of the Legiones Astartes to find their gene sire. The Legion's morale was low. It was bad enough that they were burdened with the only Primarch to fail in conquering his homeworld. If they discovered he was doomed to die before the Great Crusade's end, it would annihilate what little morale remained amongst the Space Marine Legion, then still called the Warhounds. At a later point, following the rediscovery of Angron, the famous Mechanicum technoarchaeologist, Archon Land, was brought to Terra and sequestered in one of the Emperor's secret sacred laboratories at the heart of an inactive volcano in a region of extensive tundra. The Master of Mankind required Land's expertise in aiding his continued investigation of Angron's cortical implants, while the Primarch lay in an induced unconscious state. Land had gained previous experience with this archaeotech device, known as a cruciamen, during his expedition into the Hexarchion vaults on Mars. The lore that had been contained within had represented a moral threat to mankind, including knowledge that would allow a potential perversion of human cognition. The Hexarchion vaults had been resealed by the Emperor's own decree, ratified by Fabricator General Kelbor Hal, and all Land's findings within had gone unrecorded. Land had seen the name of this ancient device within the profane texts in the Hexarchion vaults, but had never actually seen one implanted and made operational, and never one of the specific pattern and intensity implanted in the Primarch's brain in either stasis or storage. The devices similar to the butcher's nails in the sealed vault on Mars were more crude than the Nucerian construct. With the alterations made by the Nucerian device to Angron's limbic lobe and insular cortex, the Nucerian psychic surgeons had impaired the Primarch's ability to regulate any emotion at all. Furthermore, the butcher's nails had rewired Angron's brain so that he no longer had capacity to take pleasure in anything but the sensation of anger. Only neurochemicals and electrical signals related to rage and anger flowed freely through and from Angron's brain. All else was either dulled to nothingness or rewired to inspire a supreme degree of agony. It was a testament to the durability imparted to the creations of the Emperor's Primarch project that Angron had managed to survive as long as he had. Because of these neurological changes, everything caused the Primarch pain. Thinking, feeling, even breathing. The only respite Angron had was in the pleasure he now received from the neurotransmitters which carried anger and aggression. This rewriting of his neurophysiology certainly hindered Angron's higher brain functions, for the device had been cunningly wrought for a technology so crude. Land inquired of the Emperor whether he could remove the device from Angron, and the Master of Mankind replied that it was possible. However, the tendrils of the nails bit deep and had taken root in the meat of the Primarch's brain, threaded through the central nervous system, and now passed in roughly serpentine coils down around the spinal column. Even worse, Angron's limbic lobe and insular cortex had been more than just savaged by the device's insertion. They had been surgically removed even before the technology's implantation. The device hammered into Angron's skull hadn't ruined those sections of his brain. It had replaced them outright. In truth, those sections of the implant had effectively replaced those essential portions of the Primarch's brain and were now the only things keeping Angron alive. Though the Primarch's lifespan and tactical acuity had been reduced by the implant, the butcher's nails amplified his combat effectiveness in other ways to compensate. Since the Primarch was thus still able to lead warriors in combat, the Emperor decided that he would return Angron to his legion. Despite what had been done to him, a compromised Primarch was still a Primarch, and the Master of Mankind believed that Angron would still be able to fulfill his purpose as one of the Emperor's generals.
Monuments are dust, tales merely words, soon forgotten. But blood is forever.
Angron returned to the Great Crusade and took charge of his legion at the mustering grounds on the Warhound's garrison world of Bot. After his return from Terra, he swiftly worked many changes on his forces. He was given a surprisingly free hand for a newly invested Primarch, for he was not required to undergo a period in which he shadowed one of his Primarch brothers while he grew into command, or even spend time in his newfound Gene Father's company. Instead, he was given license to simply take charge of his host. With his usual bellicose energy, Angron prepared it for war. The regime of discipline and training the Decimation Legion had abided by in the past would prove to be but a shadow of what came to pass under Angron's direction and reform. Conflict became the only measure and the only judge, and training beyond its most basic elements was as real as any war or battle a World Eater's Astartes would find themselves in. Blood, live rounds and bared blades, fighting pits and gladiatorial combat. These were the methods now used to test the mettle of the Primarch's gene sons to make them more brutal and efficient killers in the image of their genetic father. Each warrior soon bore scars by which to count the lessons learned amid heat and the bitter volcanic sands, and those that failed did not live long enough to try again. Knowing how successful his own cortical implants could be at boosting a warrior's prowess in battle, Angron ordered his apothecarian to insert the Butcher's Nails implants within every Astartes of the World Eaters Legion to enhance aggression and pain tolerance far beyond that which even the gene-engineered flesh of a space marine was capable. But the drawbacks were that the implants and the such surgical procedures required to place them in the brain left the individual devoid of joy or peace, save for that found in battle, just like their Primarch. In this dark endeavor, Angron ordered the study of his Butcher's Nails implant by the 13th Legion's Tech Marines to serve as a template for the manufacture of new versions of the devices. However, this proved a difficult task, for Angron's implants were a relic of a long-lost human technology, little understood by its makers, while removing them from Angron for closer study would have proved fatal to the Primarch. Early attempts to duplicate these implants by the combined efforts of the Legion's Tech Marines and apothecaries were far from successful. Under the supervision of Apothecary Galen Surlak, the implantation of new copies of the Butcher's Nails resulted in a 100% mortality rate among the Astartes volunteers. But Angron persisted in his demands that all his warriors ultimately be implanted with the same crude device. In the early days of Angron's leadership of the Thortunmith Legion, the Primarch still refused to acknowledge most of his sons, since none were strong enough to survive the implantation of the Butcher's Nails. At one point, Angron simply abandoned his legion after hijacking a frigate and disappeared without a trace. It took 2 Terran years of searching, but eventually, the World Eater's missing Primarch was tracked down by Centurion Karn, the Primarch's equerry, who discovered him upon a backwater feral world. Here, Angron lived like a savage, seeking a foe that would put him out of his misery. Shocked by this revelation, Karn chastised Angron and reminded him of his Nucerian comrades and how they would have loathed to see him in such a pitiful state. This argument finally convinced Angron to rejoin his legion with the promise that he would try to lead the World Eaters in such a way that they would shed their weakness. In the years that followed, the Liber Malus speaks of whole star systems surrendering wholesale when the World Eater's fleet was detected entering the system rather than face the wrath of Angron's space marines. So potent had their bloody legend grown. With this legend came dark tales of atrocity and wanton destruction that froze the blood of even hardened Imperial commanders and caused concern even at the level of the Imperial War Council and the other Primarchs. Not least of the 13th Legion's detractors was Robut Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, who fought beside Angron and his legion during the cleansing of Armageddon, and saw at first hand the bloodbath they left in the wake of their attack on the Basalt Citadel, where the last defenders of this non-compliant human world had made their stand. Guilliman had seen the ramp of World Eaters' corpses that had been used to finally mount a breach in the mighty fortress, and the vengeful horror the Space Marines had wrought within, and been sickened. Angron soon earned the nickname the Red Angel for the bloody atrocities committed across the width and breadth of the galaxy. Of all his titles, given in glory or earned in infamy, Angron most despised being named the Red Angel. The Imperium already had an angel in Sanguinius, and Angron had no desire to ape the Fey mutant that commanded the Ixth Legion. For all his flaws, he was his own man, and took pride in that above all else. Though Angron loathed this particular epithet, it later proved among his most fitting titles. Despite the tally of victories garnered by this brutal Space Marine Legion, it came at a dire cost. Most infamously, Angron ordered his warriors to conquer a targeted world within 31 solar hours, the length of a single Nucerian local day, and the time in which it took Angron to score his greatest victory upon his former homeworld. Despite their best efforts, the World Eaters consistently failed to subjugate worlds within this set time limit. Each time they failed, they were ordered by their gene-sire to undergo the barbaric punishment known as Decimation, forcing 1 out of every 10 World Eaters to be killed by 9 other battle brothers in his unit. This brutal punishment proved to be too much to bear for one veteran World Eater's officer, and matters quickly came to a head during the campaign known as the Second Compliance of Ghenna. Ghenna was an isolated human world that had endured many of the horrors of Old Night. Its society was fairly technically advanced, but unfortunately its population was overcome with genetic diseases. By the time of the Great Crusade, there were less than 1,000 Gehennans that remained, kept alive in life pods. When this world, classified as 9315 by the expeditionary fleets of the Crusade, was rediscovered by the Imperium, they initially accepted Imperial rule peacefully. But after several Terran years of Imperial occupation, all contact with the world was lost. The World Eaters under Angron were dispatched to investigate, and negotiations quickly broke down with the Gennans when it was discovered that they had modified their own forms and were using an apparent form of abominable intelligence. Angron ordered a hasty invasion of the planet, and per the Primarch's tradition, the World Eaters demanded that the world be subjugated within 31 solar hours. Failure to do so, the Primarch declared, would result in the draconian punishment known as Decimation, in which 1 of every 10 World Eaters was executed. The prospect of 1 of every 10 World Eaters being executed for their failure, as well as inadequate orbital, armor, and artillery support, led to a hasty and poorly executed landing on the planet under the command of the veteran, Terran-born Centurion Mago of the 18th Company, who was desperate to avoid yet another series of deaths among his own Legion brothers. Yet, when the World Eaters' forces reached Ghenna's surface, they faced no resistance, for the entire planetary population actually consisted of billions of artificially intelligent simulacrums designed to appear human. These simple, unarmed constructs used their sheer numbers to swarm the Astartes, killing Space Marine after Space Marine, no matter how many simulacrums were destroyed. Despite Mago's best efforts, for a time, it seemed the World Eaters would be overrun. Though the World Eaters finally received adequate heavy armor and artillery support, just as they forced a breach and broke their way inside the confines of the main Ghennan city, the World Eaters once again failed to meet their Primarch's allotted time frame of 31 solar hours to subjugate the planet, and were forced to withdraw to the flagship, the Conqueror. But aboard the Conqueror, Angron ordered the next round of decimation for his legion. Mago refused, which amused his Primarch, who instead ordered Mago to personally execute the first World Eater who would die. When Mago again refused, Angron fell into a burning rage that saw him begin to murder dozens of his own gene sons. Only the librarians of the Thotain Legion, under the command of Lectio Primus Vorias, were able to finally subdue Angron by psychically forcing him into unconsciousness, though it cost the lives of several. However, Angron would not wake from his slumber, and soon a crisis erupted within the World Eaters over what actions should be taken. During this time of instability, Apothecary Galen Surlak announced that he had created a stable method of implanting the Butcher's nails within Astartes by reverse engineering Ghennan technology. The World Eaters could now implant these archaeotech devices into warriors throughout the Legion, as Angron had demanded, since assuming control of the Thotain Legion. Mago found himself absolutely horrified at the prospect of his legion being overwhelmed by the uncontrollable rage produced by the Butcher's nails, and began to plot with his fellow Terran veterans of the Warhounds to prevent such an outcome and halt Surlak's plans. Mago subsequently made an appeal to Centurion Karn and pleaded with him to reverse the dark direction their legion was taking. However, his call for change fell on deaf ears. This forced Mago to take more drastic measures, and he gathered other disenchanted World Eaters that were loyal to him aboard the frigate Hound's Tooth. They plotted to destroy Apothecary Surlak's equipment before he could fully perfect the Butcher's nails implants for mass production and implantation. However, this attempt failed, and shortly thereafter, Karn became the first World Eater's legionary to be successfully imbued with the Butcher's nails. With this initial success, Surlak proceeded to quickly implant a further 1,000 World Eaters with the cortical implants. At this time, Angron awoke from his slumber, and with the Primarch leading these newly enhanced legionaries, the World Eaters immediately launched a counterattack against the upstart Ghennans. The World Eaters, enhanced by the rage brought by the Butcher's nails, slaughtered all those they came across, despite the massive numbers of simulacrums arrayed against them. Thanks to Surlac's efforts through his reverse engineering of Ghennan technology, he was able to localize and pinpoint the location of the command signal that was controlling the actions of the simulacrums. By tracing the signals, the World Eaters discovered the shriveled remains of the last true living Ghennans, where they lay in their life pods. There were only a little over 1,000 true Ghennans, with each mentally controlling thousands of simulacrums. The Ghennans pleaded with the blood-maddened World Eaters to be spared, but Karn replied disdainfully that the galaxy belonged to the Imperium and proceeded to massacre them all. Meanwhile, Mago and his conspirators felt they had no options left to save their legion. They plotted to subdue Angron, Karn, and the other World Eaters who had been imbued with the Butcher's nails. They intended to bring them before the Emperor himself for judgment. After the massacre of the Ghennans was carried out, the World Eaters on the surface were confronted by Mago and his supporters. They pleaded with their Primarch and Karn to halt the madness, but once again, their pleas were ignored, and soon, a battle broke out between both factions. During the subsequent fighting, Mago was confronted by, and bested, his former friend Karn, and before he was beheaded, made a final declaration. The Ortamoth Legion would be damned by their actions, and the dark path Angron was forcing them to walk. The Centurion's final words would later prove to be prophetic. With the death of their commander, the remaining rebels halted in mid-battle and submitted themselves for Angron's judgment. With the Yevtinith Legion once again unified, the World Eaters proceeded to scour the surface of Ghenna clean of life, leaving no structure intact and no Ghennan left alive in a single night of monumental bloodshed. It was said that the psychic death screams of the dying were audible to Imperial astropaths across half the sector. In the aftermath of this massacre, calls for censure against the World Eaters resounded within the Terran Council. Soon after, Primarch Leman Russ and his Space Wolves Legion were dispatched to Ghenna to confront Angron and his World Eaters and to halt the implantation of the deadly cortical implants. Following the infamous events of the Ghenna Massacre, the World Eaters were publicly censured by the Emperor and commanded to stop using the cortical implants. Imperial records state that 2 Primarchs came to Angron, both claiming to have been sent by the Emperor, intending to convince him to stop the dangerous practice. The first arrived soon after Angron joined his legion following his unwilling rescue from Nuceria. The second would not come until almost a Terran century later, but by then it would be too late to stop the tragedy that had already begun to unfold for the Yevtinith Legion. The Night of the Wolf is a little-known incident that occurred shortly after the massacre of the entire planetary population of Ghenna. Leman Russ had been charged by the Emperor to take his Space Wolves Legion to Ghenna to bring the World Eaters to heel. The 2 legions met at Malkoya on the fields beyond the dead Ghennan city of that same name. The World Eaters, battered and bleeding from Ghenna's Imperial compliance campaign, formed ragged lines before the assembled Space Wolves Legion. The Primarch stood before their hosts, armed and armored, Angron awash with blood and carved up by fresh wounds, Leman Russ in resplendent battle plate, the color of the storms on his tempestuous homeworld of Fenris. In these early years of the Great Crusade, Angron still carried his first axe, the precursor to all others. He called it Widowmaker. It would break this very day, never to be used again. Russ carried Krakenmaw, his immense chainsword, toothed by some Fenrisian sea devil from that blighted world's many myths. Angron refused to recognize his brother's authority and warned the Wolf King to depart before the situation became something that he would regret. But Russ refused to be cowed by the warlike Primarch. He informed Angron that the implantation surgeries must end, for the Emperor himself had deemed it necessary. The massacres of newly discovered human worlds were also to end with the fall of Ghenna. The World Eaters were to submit to the Space Wolves as their escorts for their legion's return to Terra. Once they reached the Imperial Palace, everything would be done to remove the parasitic butcher's nails implants from the World Eater's minds. Angron was not amused by Russ's implied threats. No one ever saw who fired the first shot. In the decades after, the World Eaters claimed it came from the Space Wolves' lines, and the Space Wolves claimed the same of the Thorteen Legion. Without either Primarch giving an order, the two Space Marine legions fought. The Night of the Wolf, it was later called. Imperial archives later referred to it as the Ghenna Scouring, omitting the moment the World Eaters and Space Wolves drew blood. The conflict would prove to be a source of pride for both legions and a source of secret shame. Both claimed victory, but both feared they had actually lost, and in truth, the battle proved bloody but inconclusive. Yet, at its end, the World Eaters did not return to Terra, and Angron refused to stop the implantation of his Astartes with the Butcher's nails. Paying no heed to the Emperor's command, Angron ordered his tech marines to continue to use the Butcher's nails cortical implant technology until nearly every World Eater Space Marine had undergone the surgery. Blood rites like blood drinking and vicious gladiatorial combats became an increasingly important part of the World Eaters' legionary rituals and customs as they continued to slaughter their way across a broad swathe of the galaxy. It soon became common practice for World Eaters to compete in the number of skulls that they could take in battle. For some World Eaters Space Marines, the result was an uncontrollable thirst for slaughter even away from the battlefield. However, the results produced by the World Eaters on the front lines were so effective that the Imperium and its Emperor proved willing to turn a blind eye to the World Eaters' savage practices for quite some time during the rest of the Great Crusade. This would prove to be a terrible miscalculation, as the World Eaters were already falling under the sway of the blood god Khorne, and would prove a ready ally of the War Master Horus once he began his great betrayal of the Imperium. By the dawn of the 31st millennium, as the World Eaters' vicious savagery only worsened, many of Angron's brother Primarchs voiced their concerns to the Emperor, yet the Master of Mankind, having left the Great Crusade to return to Terra, proceeded to seek help from an unfortunate source. He dispatched Horus, the Primarch he trusted over all others, to confront Angron and bring him back into the Imperial fold. Yet Horus was a master manipulator, and unknown to the Emperor, had already himself been corrupted by the ruinous powers of chaos following his campaign to reconquer the plague moon of Davin. In Angron, Horus saw a warrior consumed by bitterness and resentment towards the Emperor, and it was simple for the War Master to feed that bitterness and emphasize the Emperor's betrayal of the World Eater Primarch at Nuceria. This fed Angron's perception that the Emperor was a weakling in need of replacement by a stronger ruler, a ruler like Horus. Horus had told Angron exactly what he wanted to hear. When the Horus Heresy began, plunging the galaxy into civil war, Angron's World Eaters joyfully marched beside the War Master into treachery. Thus, the World Eaters became one of Horus's original 4 traitor legions, along with the Death Guard, the Word Bearers, and Horus's own Sons of Horus. During the first battle of the Horus Heresy, the Istvaan III Atrocity, Horus at last declared his traitorous hand and openly defied the Emperor. Angron led the World Eaters personally in the first surface assault on Istvaan III to destroy the remaining loyalist Astartes of the 4 original traitor legions, including his own loyalist World Eaters, who had survived the traitorous virus bombing of Istvaan III's planetary capital of the Coral City by Horus's orbiting fleet. Horus had deceitfully launched this treacherous saturation bombardment of the planet after the 4 traitor legions' known loyalists were already engaged against the Slaaneshi rebels who held the world. The deadly cargo, which contained the ferocious flesh-eating life-eater virus held within the virus bombs, killed billions of innocents, whose psychic death scream was said to be louder than the holy beacon of the Astronomicon. But much to the traitors' surprise, nearly 2/3 of the loyalists from the first wave survived the orbital bombardment, thanks in no small part to the timely warning of the loyalist Emperor's children captain Saul Tarvitz. Taking matters into his own hands, Angron defied Horus's plans and spearheaded a second drop pod wave after the bombardment failed to eliminate all of the Loyalists. The War Master and his allies could only look on in outrage as the Red Angel made planetfall at the head of a full 50 companies of his bloodthirsty Astartes, landing in the plaza areas to the west of the Precentor's palace, hunting for their own kin with fratricide in their hearts. The World Eaters bloodily massacred most of their Loyalist battle brothers, plunging into their former comrades' ranks like a white-hot dagger. Incensed at his brother's disobedience, the War Master saw no choice but to support his ill-tempered and impulsive ally, since the atmospheric after-effects of the global firestorm unleashed by the virus bombs made it impossible to carry out an immediate, accurate orbital bombardment. Horus ordered all of the traitor forces to commence a ground attack to salvage victory from disorder. Nearly 2 full solar months passed on the dead world of Istvaan III as the Loyalist survivors stalled the War Master's plans by tenaciously holding out against the traitor forces. But their numbers quickly waned against the traitors' reinforcements and steady supply of munitions. Eventually, once the world's atmosphere had cleared enough to make accurate orbital fire once again possible, the traitors leveraged their superiority of arms, and soon the slaughter swung decisively in the War Master's favor following another orbital bombardment of the Loyalist positions. The gauntlet had been thrown down, and the Post-Heresy had truly begun.
Let history mark my words well, for I care nothing about who sits proud on the throne of Terra when the last day dawns. Horus is a fine commander, but that's the limit of my admiration for that arrogant, preening bastard. I joined his rebellion because I can tolerate him easier than I can endure the abomination that names himself master of mankind. You want the truth of my life and death. I am Angron, the eater of worlds, and I am already dead. I died over 100 years ago, in the mountains north of the city that enslaved me. I died after Decimation.
During the opening days of the Post-Heresy, Lorgar, Primarch of the Word-Bearers Legion, had ordered his 2 most trusted advisors, First Chaplain Erebus and the Dark Apostle Cor Ferrin, to unleash their wrath against the realm of Ultramar. This was done in retaliation for the humiliation the Decimation Legion had been forced to endure by being forced to kneel in disgrace before the Emperor and Robut Guilliman and his Ultramarines on the world of Kur by the Third Legion at the Emperor's orders during the Great Crusade for their failure to enforce the imperial truth. The Word-Bearers proceeded to achieve a monumental victory at the Battle of Calth, which ensued. The Ultramarines Legion was badly crippled and no longer presented a viable threat to Horus's plan to drive on Terra. Erebus had managed to complete his blasphemous ritual on Calth's surface, which summoned the beginnings of the sorcerous ruinstorm to the galaxy's eastern fringe. A monstrous warp storm larger and more destructive than anything spacefaring humanity had witnessed since the days of the Age of Strife. Simultaneous with the Word-Bearers' assault on Calth, Lorgar and the more reliable Word-Bearers under his command launched a second offensive, a joint shadow crusade with Angron's World Eaters Legion into the rest of the realm of Ultramar, laying waste to the 500 worlds with reckless abandon, slaughtering 26 worlds in rapid succession. This campaign was intended to ensure the success of the sorcerous Ruinstorm, which would ultimately split the void asunder, dividing the galaxy in 2 and rendering vast tracts of the Imperium impassable for as long as it lasted, effectively cutting Ultramar off from the rest of the Imperium. This prodigious warp storm would deny needed reinforcements to the Loyalists as Horus drove on Terra in an attempt to overthrow the Emperor of mankind. Nothing from Terra would get in, and nothing would get out. Not even an astropathic whisper would be able to pierce the storm of warp energy bleeding into real space. At some point during the Shadow Crusade, while fighting alongside the Word-Bearers, the World Eaters fought in a direct confrontation against the Ultramarines Legion upon the war world of Armatura. During the brutal assault, the Ultramarines managed to lure the enraged World Eaters into a trap as they assaulted the main quarter of the ruined capital city, collapsing buildings and burying many of the World Eaters and Angron under tons of rubble. The Red Angel's twin chain axes were ruined as they had lost their teeth during the brutal fighting. After Angron managed to crawl from the strewn rubble, he threw his axe Gorechild away, for it would never function again. In the aftermath of the battle, Angron's equerry Karn found the discarded weapon and picked it up. He knew he risked his Primarch's wrath by violating Angron's superstition that inherited weapons brought ill luck, a gladiatorial conceit taken from Nuceria, but still had Gorechild repaired, and has used the mighty weapon ever since that day. During this campaign of destruction, Lorgar came to realize that over the course of their Shadow Crusade, Angron's temperament and mental stability had steadily grown worse. The Butcher's nails were killing him faster than the Emperor's experts, or Lorgar had originally imagined, faster than anyone realized. The rate of neural degeneration had accelerated very quickly in the months after the Battle of Calth. The implants had never been designed for the peculiar genetics of a Primarch's brain. Angron's physiology was constantly trying to heal the damage produced by the implants as the nails bit deeper. To save his life, Lorgar convinced the Lord of the World Eaters to go back to his homeworld of Nuceria. The overlords of the gladiatorial games on that world who had first inserted the foul device into Angron's skull would know more of the implant's function than the Traitor Legion's savants and the Dark Mechanicum. Lorgar promised that the two Primarchs would learn all that was known about the Nucerians' insidious cortical implant technology, and then they would burn that loathsome world until its surface was nothing but glass. Angron would at last take the vengeance he pretended to no longer desire. Whether Angron fought him, hated him, or trusted him mattered little to Lorgar, who intended to drag Angron into the immortality that he deserved from the Dark Gods, whether he wanted it or not. Once on Nuceria, Angron paid his respects to his fallen brothers and sisters amongst the Nucerian gladiators he had once fought beside, whose bones now lay exposed to the elements on the Desh Ilica ridge where they had died. The painful memories of that day, long ago, were too much for the Primarch to bear. After paying a visit to the city-state of Deshi to see who ruled the Nucerian city-state that had once claimed to own him, he became enraged when he was told the version of his disappearance told by the Nucerian slave masters. It was explained that he had fled in fear from the Battle of Desh Ilica Ridge and the subsequent massacre of the rebel army in the mountains. The rebels had died to a man in his absence. Enraged by the lies that had been told about him over the last century, Angron ordered his legion to kill everyone in the city. Then they were to kill everyone on the planet. Robot Guilliman's ultramarine retribution fleet, which had been tracking the rest of the Word-Bearer's Legion in the wake of the Battle of Calth, finally caught up to the traitors while they carried out their massacre on Nuceria. The Taygith Legion's Warship Courage. Above all, Guilliman's temporary flagship broke warp at the system's edge, at the head of a large void armada consisting of 41 vessels. The Ultramarines' armada looked wounded, cobbled together from separate fleets. It was not a dedicated interdiction war fleet, but clearly a ragtag strike force, a lance thrust intended to strike at the enemy's heart. Guilliman himself had done the best he could with limited resources. The Taysirith Legion's cruisers and battleships ran abeam of the enemy fleet for repeated exchange of broadsides, offering targets too big and powerful to ignore, while the rest of the Ultramarines' fleet used calculated lance strikes from safer range. The Armada then divided its assault potential, doing its utmost to destroy Lorgar's flagship Fidelitas Lex, and attempted to capture the World Eater's flagship Conqueror in a boarding action. But the Ultramarines' warships not only fought a void war, they also took the fight to the surface of Nuceria, for this conflict was personal. The Ultramarines had come for revenge against Lorgar and the Word-Bearers, just as they had pursued Corferin all the way to the Maelstrom on the other side of Ultramar. Several Ultramarines' warships attempted to make a run on Nuceria, hemorrhaging drop pods, landers, and gunships, forcing planetfall by any means necessary. The Ultramarine fleet swept over and against the traitors like an insect horde. But the tenacious commander of the Conqueror, Lotara Saren, put up a difficult fight and destroyed a number of Ultramarines' vessels that attempted to make a run for the surface. Though the World Eater's flagship transformed a number of the smaller vessels into flaming wreckage, the Ultramarines eventually punched through her tenacious defense and managed to land troops on the surface of Nuceria. As was their way, the Ultramarines established footholds at defensible positions, clearing room for their reinforcements to land. For every position they held, another was overrun by the World Eaters in a storm of roaring axes or lost to the word-bearers chanting implacable advance. The Thotemith Legion crashed against the 13th in rabid packs, showing why Imperial forces had feared to fight alongside them for decades. Uncontrolled, unbound, unrestrained, they butchered their way through Ultramarines' strong points, enslaved to the joy of battle because of the butcher's nails implants sandwiched within the meat of their minds. The Ultramarines returned the World Eater's ferocity in kind, hungry for vengeance against the vile traitors who had defiled Calth and damaged its star. Word-bearers' units also marched into the fray against the Loyalists, droning black hymns and chanting sermons from the Book of Lorgar, bearing corpse-strewn icons of befouled metal and bleached bones above their regiments. Meanwhile, far above Nuceria, the Fidelitas Lex was already a ruin, its armor pitted and cracked, its shields a memory. The cathedrals and spinal fortresses barnacling along its back were gone, laid waste by the Ultramarines' incendiary rage. The 13th Legion's armada attacked in strafing runs and protracted exchanges of broadsides, trading fire with the superior warship and accepting their own casualties as the cost of bleeding the bigger vessel dry. Each assault left the Lex weaker, firing fewer turrets and cannons, taking punishment on its increasingly fragile armor. But she fought on. Crawling with smaller ships, the Lex lashed back with its remaining macro cannons, rolling in the light of its own burning hull. Guilliman guided the battle from the command deck of Courage Above All, and had decided that the Fidelitas Lex would die first, killed in the death of 1,000 cuts, and swept from the game board, while the Conqueror would be boarded and killed from within. In the course of the battle in Nucerian orbit, the Conqueror could not rise to its sister ship's defense. Both Traitor Legion flagships fought alone, starved of support, and suffering the endless attacks of the 13th Legion's ragged armada. Salvation pods streamed from the Lex's sides and underbelly, along with heavier Mechanicum craft and bulk landers. With the legionaries of the Word-Bearers already on the surface, the ship's human population fled in the vessel's final minutes. And still the great vessel fought, rolling, turning, raging. The Ultramarines' cruisers that drifted past burned as badly as the warship they were killing. This void battle was a form of dirty fighting between warships, too close for the neat calculations of ranged battery fire. Instead, it was an up-close and personal slugfest. The Ultramarines' battle barge armsmen intercepted the Conqueror and came abeam, launching assault carriers and boarding torpedoes. While the World Eater's flagship was busy repelling boarders, a number of smaller 13th Legion vessels slipped past her defenses and launched drop pods, gunships, and troop carriers. The first drop pods hammered home on the planet's surface. Sealed doors unlocked and the Ultramarines poured forth, bolters raised, moving in perfect and well-trained unity. But the World Eaters were waiting for them. Those not lost to the rage of the butcher's nails at once had the presence of mind to note that these Ultramarines were not the pristine cobalt blue warriors they had previously faced on Armatura. These legionaries of the 13th wore cracked power armor, still scarred and burn-washed from some horrendous battle solar weeks or months before. These were hardened veterans of the Battle of Calth. They burned with a cold intensity to carry out the vengeance in their hearts and were intent on getting to grips with the word-bearers and their traitor allies. As the fighting raged, the burning shell of the Fidelitas Lex cut through the clouds into the planet's atmosphere, shuddering on its way east, rolling ever downwards, achingly slow for something of such scale. The weight of the Lex's massive plasma engines dragged the stern down first, colliding with the Nucerian ocean surface far from shore. In the meantime, the demigod in gold and blue had finally found the object of his obsession amidst the clamor of war. Guilliman confronted Lorgar, possessing the advantage of two weapons, but Lorgar's Crozius gave him a reach his brother lacked. When they first met, there was no furious trading of frantic blows, nor were there any melodramatic speeches of vengeance avowed. The two Primarchs came together once, power fists against War Maul, and backed away from the resulting flare of repelling energy fields. Their warriors killed each other around them, and neither Primarch spared their Gene Sons a glance. Lorgar flicked the clinging lightning from the head of his Crozius, shaking his head in slow denial. Both Primarchs fought without heed, their godlike movements an inconceivable blur to the Space Marines fighting around them. None had ever imagined the heroes of this new age would take the field against each other, nor could they have predicted the wellsprings of spite between them. Guilliman confronted Lorgar for what his legion had done across the 500 worlds of Ultramar. In his righteous anger, the Ultramarines' Primarch struck Lorgar with one of his fists, battering the Word-Bearer's Primarch's sternum. Lorgar repulsed him with a projected burst of telekinesis, weak and wavering, but enough to send his brother staggering. The Crozius followed, its power field trailing lightning as Lorgar hammered it into the side of Guilliman's head with the force of a cannonball. Both Primarchs faced each other beneath the gray sky, one bleeding internally, the other with half of his face lost to blood sheeting from a fractured skull. As the two Primarchs were locked in their furious life and death struggle, they were oblivious to the destruction being wrought around them. Suddenly, Angron burst forth from the Ultramarines' ranks, his armor a shattered wreck, and both of his chainswords spat gobbets of ceramite armor, plating, and scarlet gore. Angron was plastered with the blood of the slain after hours in the crush of the front lines of intense combat. On his chest hung a bandolier of skulls taken from the mass grave at Deshwilika Ridge. Blood painted them as surely as it marked Angron. Even through the constant pain generated by the butcher's nails, that pleased him. He wanted his deceased brothers and sisters to taste blood once more. He had carried them with him across Nuceria, letting their empty eyes witness the razing of his former, hated homeworld. The World Eater launched himself at Guilliman with murderous hatred. The two Primarchs fell into a seamless, roaring duel where Lorgar and Guilliman had abandoned theirs. Guilliman found himself forced back by the storm of Angron's blows. As the two Primarchs fought, Guilliman landed a glancing blow, his fist pounding across Angron's breastplate. One of the skulls of Angron's fallen fellow gladiators that hung from the chain worn across his breastplate was partially shattered and scattered across the ground. Guilliman stepped back, his boot crushing the skull's remnants to powder. Angron saw the desecration and threw himself at his brother, his howl of wrath defying mortal origins, impossibly ripe in its anguish. Lorgar saw it too. The moment Guilliman's boot broke the skull, he felt the warp boil behind the veil. The bearer of the word started chanting in a language never before spoken by any living being, his words in faultless harmony with Angron's cry of torment. Lorgar enacted his dark plan to save his brother's life, summoning the ruin storm to the world of Nuceria, tearing the sky open and unleashing a crimson torrent formed from the ghosts of 100 murdered worlds, raining blood down upon the battlefield. Lorgar focused his concentration on the triumphant form of his mutilated brother, calling for the Neverborn, the entities humanity called demons, to answer in kind. He locked Angron's muscles, setting fire to the synapses in his brain. The first spasms racked their way through Angron's sinews, turning his blood to quicksilver, then to lava, and at last to unholy fire. His cries of thwarted rage were tainted by an agony beyond comprehension. His body started tearing itself apart, growing, rising, perfecting, after a lifetime of broken torture. This was the moment of Angron's apotheosis into demonhood. The World Eater's librarians, those few who had never received the deadly butcher's nails implants which were inimical to psychers, sensed the fey powers summoned by Lorgar from the warp. In an attempt to halt the Urizen's dark plans, the 19 remaining librarians harnessed their collective psychic powers to manifest a psychic entity known as the Communion, the Gestalt consciousness of 19 psychic minds. In the midst of Lorgar's incantations, the Communion pulled the soul of the Primarch from his body. The two psychic entities confronted one another within the warp, locked in a deadly contest of wills, each convinced that they were the one responsible for saving Angron. But ultimately, the Communion failed, for Lorgar was just as powerful in the warp as he was in the material universe. After Angron's completed metamorphosis into a new demon prince, the demon Primarch turned his attention to the librarians, the creatures that had pained him for solar decades, the warriors that had made the butcher's nails sing and his brain bleed just for the sin of standing near them. Now they moved against his brother, hurling their foulness at Lorgar, who crouched one-handed and wounded, down on his knees. The newly ascended demon Primarch's rage killed the remaining librarians, each of them tasting a different doom. Angron finally expunged from his legion the weakness that had plagued his gene sons since his reunification with them a century earlier. The Librarius of the World Eaters, the last fragment of the original Warhounds within the Thoth Legion, was no more, a fact which greatly pleased the blood god Khorne, who would not brook the existence of any psychers amongst his chosen servants. Lorgar had offered up the Ivor-Tamwith Legion to the whims of the blood god as his loyal servants. Now there would only be blood, an ocean of blood carried on a tide of eternal slaughter. In the wake of Angron's transformation, a gravely wounded Roboute Guilliman escaped from Nuceria, unable to face or even fully comprehend what both of his brothers had become through their corruption by the ruinous powers. The World Eaters completed their purge of Nuceria until not one human life remained on the benighted world. Angron, now the very embodiment of the blood god's eightfold path, shook the dust of the world from his feet and did not think of it again. Lorgar believed that he had saved his brother. In his mind, it was the only way, for he alone had sought to save Angron from the implants that were killing him by degrees. Only Lorgar had found a way to free Angron from an existence of unrivaled agony, and he alone had acted to save his tormented brother. Now the Shadow Crusade could move on from Ultramar and rejoin Horus. The next target for the traitors would be Terra itself. Once back aboard his flagship Conqueror, the newly ascendant demon Primarch spoke his first words in his new form. He ordered Karn to massacre the slaves in the lower holds and build him a massive skull throne. To enhance the combat prowess of his new form, Angron was given a massive black rune sword called the Black Blade that had been forged for him by the Dark Mechanicum. After the Shadow Crusade, the demon Primarch Angron and his World Eaters proceeded to go on a bloody rampage throughout the width and breadth of the galaxy, ignoring the War Master Horus's calls to muster at Ulanor in preparation for the final drive on the throne world. Perturabo, the Lord of Iron, Primarch of the Iron Warriors Legion, was ordered by Horus to bring Angron at all costs to Ulanor. The Iron Warriors tracked the World Eaters to the world of Deluge, where they discovered the planet's entire population had been butchered and stacked into mountains of corpses. Shortly thereafter, they were set upon by berserker-crazed World Eaters and Khornate demons. After withstanding this initial onslaught, the sky opened up, and the demon Primarch Angron entered the carnage. Perturabo and Angron engaged in a brutal battle, with the demon Primarch having the upper hand in both power and speed. However, despite sustaining several wounds, the Lord of Iron endured and goaded Angron. He declared that Angron had been born a slave and would now remain one, enslaved to darkness for all eternity. Utilizing his superior tactical acumen and with the aid of the Iron Warriors and his Iron Circle of robotic honor guards, Perturabo was able to outmaneuver and bombard the World Eaters, pounding them into submission and besting Angron in the process. However, at that moment, an ultramarine fleet appeared in orbit above the planet. Angron merely laughed, declaring that they were now all going to die. Perturabo retorted by reminding Angron that he had once seen his own warriors butchered by the slave masters on Nuceria and had done nothing to stop it. This moved the demon Primarch to act, and after conjuring a warp storm, both the Iron Warriors and World Eaters' fleets managed to evade the Ultramarines and make their way towards Alinor. Angron would subsequently appear during the climax of the Solar War, when a massive warp rift opened up over Luna. This allowed the primary traitor strike force to assail the throne world itself. The demon Primarch was seen perched during the battle over Luna aboard one of the battlements of his flagship Conqueror. By the time the siege of Terra commenced, Angron had become fully enslaved to the will of the blood god Khorne and his own unquenchable bloodlust. He demanded that Horus allow him to directly assault the Imperial Palace, regardless of the fact that the Emperor's powerful psychic barrier around the throne world would more than likely kill the demon prince until the traitors had found a way to weaken it. When word reached Angron that the Death Guard would instead be the ones to spearhead the traitor assault on Terra, Angron fell into an incandescent rage and massacred all those within the bowels of the Conqueror who had the misfortune to cross the demon Primarch's path. Lotara Sarin, the mortal human captain of the Conqueror, feared that if Angron wasn't stopped, he would inadvertently murder the tech priests responsible for attending to the vessel's plasma reactor, putting the Conqueror at risk of a catastrophic explosion. To prevent this, Sarin conspired with the Night Lord's captain Gendor Scrivok, the Painted Count, as well as Karn, to have Angron teleported to the shifting maze aboard the Night Lord's flagship Nightfall that had long been used by Conrad Kurza to torture and kill captives. Forcing Karn's hand, the 8th captain confronted the enraged demon Primarch himself. Angron informed his equerry that the dark gods had whispered to him of Karn's ultimate fate and preordained destiny as the chosen of Khorne. The demon Primarch wished to supplant Karn as the blood god's chosen, and so the two battled one another. However, Karn proved unable to match his genesire's prowess. Before Angron could slay him, Karn placed a teleport Homer on the demon Primarch and had him teleported off the Conqueror and into the bowels of the Nightfall. In the bowels of the Night Lord's flagship, Angron found himself trapped within a labyrinth of singular purpose. At the request of the Night Haunter, the Iron Warrior's Primarch Perturabo had crafted his grim brother a singular prison, unlike any other, in imitation of Perturabo's own private sanctorum known as the Cavea Ferrum. This special prison was an elaborate labyrinth whose featureless walls and strange geometric design made it all but impossible to map and therefore escape. Anyone who attempted to mentally map the labyrinth would be hopelessly knotted in turns that should have been physically impossible. Even after trying scores of times to map the labyrinth, an individual would only manage more than a handful of turns within its twisting corridors before it all stopped making sense. Following the drop site massacre of Istvaan IV, the Night Haunter had captured his brother Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamanders, and utilized the labyrinth as a means to torture and psychologically break him over a period of several solar months. Angron quickly became trapped within the maze, forever trying to find his way out of its twists and turns, and battling assaults by the multitude of traps hidden within the labyrinth. Meanwhile, the traitors on Terra's surface had used a series of rituals to finally weaken the Emperor's psychic barrier around the throne world so that they could deploy their demonic allies on its surface. The demon Primarch was shot from the hold of the Nightfall and into the void of space. Angron soon hurtled towards the throne world's surface. When the demon Primarch entered Terra's atmosphere, he appeared as a massive flaming meteor. As his body slammed into the surface of Terra, the shockwave of the demon Primarch's impact slew friend and foe alike. Wielding the Black Blade, Angron proceeded to rampage through the Loyalist forces, fighting his way to the walls of the Imperial Palace itself. Here he saw his brother Sanguinius, the angelic Primarch of the Blood Angels, and bellowed a challenge. In response, Sanguinius merely saluted his brother and refused. Before withdrawing back into the confines of the Imperial Palace, Sanguinius claimed that while they would one day battle, it was not that day. The demon Primarch roared in frustration, unable to circumvent the lingering effects of the Emperor's psychic barrier to pursue what he perceived as his cowardly brother into the palace. As the siege of Terra raged on, during the battle for the Lion's Gate spaceport, Angron destroyed both a Capital Imperialis super-heavy Imperial tank and then a Leviathan transport, but was still unable to advance past the Imperial Palace's walls. But eventually, the Lion's Gate spaceport fell to the traitors when they launched a massive assault. As the Emperor's psychic barrier shrank to encompass the Sanctum Imperialis, Angron led a horde of blood-maddened Worlds Eaters onto the Eternity Wall and began slaughtering the Loyalist defenders. Newly blessed with demonic gifts, Angron and his World Eaters overtook the Loyalist defenders of the Eternity Wall. Later, the World Eaters had the duty and privilege of leading the frontal assault on the palace. The surviving video logs from the siege show the World Eaters breaching the walls of the palace, the twisted red form of Angron wielding his glowing runezord at their head. Among those first into the breach was Karn. Despite contrary claims by the Sons of Horus, World Eater records indicate that it was Angron's demonic Black Blade that was responsible for the downfall of the Great Gate of the Imperial Palace. The World Eaters reaped a true harvest of blood on Terra, but they were denied ultimate victory. With both the Dark Angels and Space Wolves legions on their way to Terra to reinforce the Loyalist defenders, Horus gambled everything in order to win the siege, lowering the void shields on his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, and daring the Emperor to come aboard and face him. The Master of Mankind rose to the challenge and faced his betrayer in the combat that decided the fate of the galaxy. The two fought a titanic combat that was both physical and psychic, until at last the Emperor had slain Horus and utterly obliterated even his soul from existence, but only at the cost of his own humanity and eternal internment in the Golden Throne. The mighty Chaos army disintegrated with the loss of its greatest champion and fled Terra. Angron was the last to leave, looking back from his dropship longingly at the Imperial Palace, which had stood against even his fury. He led his surviving World Eaters deep into the refuge of the Great Warp Rift that was the Eye of Terror in the northwestern reaches of the galaxy. He and his heretic Astartes would now have all of eternity to seek revenge as part of the long war against the Corpse Emperor's forces to come. With the Horus heresy ended, the World Eaters fled into the Eye of Terror to a demon world specially prepared for Angron by Khorne, though the legions swiftly degenerated into roving warbands of Chaos Space Marines as the incessant and bloodthirsty demands of Khorne drove the World Eaters to turn in upon themselves. As such, even to the present time, they have no particular home base, with each band generally operating from whatever starship they can lay their blood-stained hands upon. Angron sightings in the Materium have been mercifully rare in the millennia after the Horus heresy, since it appears that the demon Primarch is busy either prosecuting his patron's wars with the other forces of chaos or ruling his personal demon world within the Eye of Terror. There are, however, several well-documented occasions after the end of the Horus heresy where Angron himself led the Blood God's forces against the Imperium. In the mid-38th millennium, Angron and 50,000 Chaos Space Marines and troops drawn from the other forces of Chaos slaughtered their way through a large swath of Imperial space for over 2 standard centuries. They took control of over 70 sectors. In response, a combined force of 4 Space Marine chapters, 2 Titan legions, and more than 30 Astra Militarum regiments participated in a massive Imperial crusade to retake what the Imperium had lost to the Red Angels' assault. 90% of the territory that had been lost to Angron's forces was eventually recovered by the Imperium's defenders. This protracted campaign is known in Imperial archives as the Dominion of Fire. The conflict, later known as the First War for Armageddon, began within the Eye of Terror. The forces within, being devoted to the service of chaos and the ruinous powers, usually fought against each other as was their fractious nature, but occasionally and inexplicably they put aside their rivalries to launch an assault on their common enemy, the Imperium of Man. In this case, the unity of the ruinous powers was triggered by the arrival of the Space Hulk Devourer of Stars around a demon world within the Eye of Terror that was controlled by Angron and his World Eaters. Angron had spent much of the 10 millennia following the Horus Heresy attempting to restore some level of unity amongst the divided warbands of what had once been his Decimation Legion of Space Marines. The World Eaters' dedication to the blood god Khorne during the Horus Heresy had reduced them for much of that time into a fractious force of Khornate berserkers just as likely to kill each other as their true foes. The emergence of the Devourer of Stars into orbit around Angron's demon world provided just the opportunity he had been looking for to recreate some semblance of common purpose for his scattered legion. The Space Hulk proved sufficiently large enough to carry large numbers of Chaos troops, but only on an erratic course into real space. This is how the forces of Chaos unexpectedly emerged from the warp aboard the Space Hulk in the Armageddon system in 444. M41. The arrival of Angron at Armageddon probably had nothing to do with Angron's own desires. Rather, the location was determined by the chaotic currents of the warp, which sent his Space Hulk to that hive world in the Segmentum Solar, possibly at the whim of one of the Chaos gods, if there was any intent behind the Devourer of Stars course at all. Meanwhile, on Armageddon, a series of strange events culminated in an armed rebellion, breaking out in half a dozen of the world's large hive cities against the Imperium's authority, at the same time that massive warp storms cut off the world from Imperial communications and commerce. The revolts, largely initiated by Chaos cultists taking advantage of food shortages caused by the warp storms to stir up trouble, were quickly put down in the eastern region of the world's southern subcontinent of Armageddon Secundus. But amongst the more widely scattered hives of the western region of the northern subcontinent of Armageddon Prime, the rebels proved more difficult to eradicate, as Armageddon's Planetary Defense Forces, PDF, and the few regiments of the Astra Militarum's Armageddon Steel Legion present on the world seemed capable of dealing with the revolt. No additional units were sent by the Imperium to handle the problem once the warp storms cleared. Armageddon was a very long way from the Eye of Terror in the galaxy's Segmentum Obscurus, and no one in the Imperium suspected any more sinister cause for the revolts than simple civil unrest. Busy containing the rebellion, the Imperial forces were caught by surprise when the Devourer of Stars suddenly emerged from the warp in the Armageddon system. On board the Devourer of Stars was an enormous Chaos army led by the demon Primarch Angron, including millions of Chaos cultists called the Children of Sanguinary Unholiness and the 12, the Cruor Praetoria, the 12 strongest demons of Khorne, whose lives and deeds most pleased their wretched blood god. Chaos Space Marines from the World Eaters Legion and hordes of other demonic creatures dedicated to the blood god also poured from the Space Hulk onto the surface of Armageddon and swept across the land. The insidious effects of chaos were quickly felt as nearly half the planetary defense force of Armageddon unexpectedly went over to the invaders, declaring their loyalty to the ruinous powers of chaos. The few remaining loyalist defenders were quickly routed from the subcontinent of Armageddon Prime. Falling back through the equatorial jungles in the south, the survivors joined up with the Armageddon PDF units that had been left on the subcontinent of Armageddon Secundus and prepared to make a last-ditch defense along the banks of the rivers Styx and Charon. But the expected chaos attack did not manifest itself. The warp storm that had carried the Devourer of Stars to Armageddon had started dying out, cutting off the vital supply of warp energy that allowed Angron and the other demons to remain in the Materium. Angron had reluctantly halted his advance on Armageddon Secundus and ordered his forces to build monuments to the blood god in the equatorial jungles separating both continents. The Chaos Army spent the following solar weeks erecting colossal piles comprised of the skulls of the fallen defenders, anointing them with the blood of sacrificed prisoners and slaves, as well as their own. The Imperial defenders gained valuable time while Angron raised bloody monuments to the blood god. Many wondered why the monstrous Primarch halted with victory in his grasp, but in truth, Angron had no choice. Without the supply of raw warp energy generated by the construction of the monuments and the sacrifices, the demonic components of his army would soon start to dissolve back into the warp, unable to maintain their presence in the materium. When his supply lines were finally secured and his army emerged from the equatorial jungles that separated Armageddon Prime from Armageddon Secundus, Angron found the Imperial defenders ready and waiting, and reinforced by the Space Wolves. Unknown to the forces of chaos, the great company of Space Wolves Astartes, led by the chapter's Great Wolf, Chapter Master. Logan Grimnar had been assigned to the defense of this sector of the Imperium, and they moved quickly to provide aid to the beleaguered defenders as soon as they received the astropathic distress messages from Armageddon describing the chaos invasion of the Hive world. Huge battles erupted along the entire front. In the east, along the Sharon River, the Imperial forces held, but towards the west on the Styx River, Angron led the way himself. He smashed through the Imperial lines and led his forces towards Hive Infernus and Hive Hellsreach. But there Logan Grimnar unleashed his secret weapon. He had called for the assistance of the Grey Knights, the psychic space marine chapter that served the Ordo Malleus of the Inquisition as its chamber militant as soon as he had heard of the demonic nature of the attacking forces. Only the Grey Knights had the ability to truly defeat a demonic entity of such malevolent power as Angron. As the very existence of chaos was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Imperium of Man, few amongst even the Space Marines knew of the existence of the Grey Knights, the most elite chapter of Astartes ever formed, who were tasked specifically with combat against demons. But Grimnar had seen them in action on more than one occasion, and as the lord of an Astartes chapter, he had never been forced to submit to the inquisitorial mind wipe that was required of nearly all witnesses to the Grey Knights in action. Amongst the Grey Knights units deployed for action on Armageddon was Squad Castian, which joined an ad hoc, ragged brotherhood of Grey Knights under the command of Termar Aurelian, the brother captain of the Third Brotherhood. When the call came, the Grey Knights teleported directly into the midst of the advancing Chaos Horde, surrounding the gigantic demon Primarch. Taking heavy losses from Angron's battle prowess, the Grey Knights inflicted their own punishment, and eventually Squad Castian engaged in melee with the demon Primarch. After Angron mangled the squad, the only Grey Knight left standing was the Pyrokine, master of psychic flame, Hyperion. Trying to protect a still surviving squad mate, in a tremendous display of faith, power, and effort, Hyperion used his Psyker abilities to shatter the Primarch's demonic sword, the hideous cornate relic known as the Black Blade, while he collapsed into unconsciousness from the sheer effort. Captain Aurelian then confronted the bladeless demon Prince of Khorne and managed to banish him back to the warp, though at the cost of his own life. Hyperion was one of only 13 Grey Knights to survive the battle, out of the 109 Astartes of the Third Brotherhood who had been deployed for the campaign. Found alive but in terrible shape by the Space Wolves on the hellish field after the battle, Hyperion soon acquired the honorific Bladebreaker for his feat. He had to be put in temporary stasis in order to survive, and underwent surgery that replaced half his face and skull with augmetics. He eventually reported back to duty more than 4 solar months later. The Grey Knights had defeated the Demon Prince, hurling his spirit back into the warp from where he could not return for over 100 Terran years. At the same time as the Grey Knights were teleporting directly into the center of the demonic force to launch their attack on the Demon Primarch, the Space Wolves launched their own massive counteroffensive all along the Imperial lines. The forces of chaos were routed after they watched their leader defeated, and only the World Eaters managed to retreat back to the Space Hulk and escape into the safety of the warp. The Imperial victory was complete and overwhelming, though it had come at a great and terrible cost. During the period of the Noctis Aeterna after the birth of the Great Rift, reinforcements were cut off for both sides in the ongoing Third War for Armageddon, and those en route to the system were swept into oblivion. Those combatants who remained on Armageddon were forced to face not just each other, but oncoming waves of demons. At times, so desperate were the defenders that orcs and humans fought alongside each other against the greater threat. Such temporary ceasefires never lasted long. By the time the beacon of the Astronomicon burned bright once more, and easy travel through the Immaterium in the Imperium Sanctus was possible, an Imperial relief force arrived to find the landscape of Armageddon greatly changed. At the height of the warp storms, the demonic forces of Tzeentch and Khorne had battled each other as part of their eternal competition in the Great Game. The orcs and Imperial defenders sought cover as titanic greater demons dueled for supremacy. Fully half the planet was reshaped into a hellish landscape reminiscent of many demon worlds. A nightmare born of the warp merged with the ruins of a war-torn hive world. The Imperial reinforcements, led by elements of 9 Space Marine chapters with the Salamanders in overall command, succeeded in halting a demonic ritual that would have brought Angron back to the world that had defied him during the First War for Armageddon. In the era Indomitus, the World Eaters have reached heights of power not seen since the Great Crusade. The attempts of Angron to return to Imperial space is bad enough for the servants of the Emperor, but it now seems that he can no longer be truly banished back to the warp for a long period of time. Inquisitors aware of this phenomenon tout many different theories for the Red Angel's terrifying new attachment to real space, chief among them the amount of warp energy now pouring from the Great Rift, but even Void Ship-class weapons will only slow the demon Primarch down while he remanifests. Should Angron somehow still be cast back into the warp, he re-emerges unscathed precisely 8 weeks, 8 days, and 8 hours later, heralded by 8 crimson omens that strike fear into the hearts of all who witness them. Behind him march the warbands of the World Eaters. Each of these warbands has operated independently since the events on Scalathrax that earned Karn the Betrayer his epithet and tore the original 19th Legion asunder, but all are drawn by their fallen Gene Father's call. Some, like Gladiator Cadre 331, still wear the blue and white power armor of the Legion's heyday in the Great Crusade, while others have adapted their skills to new theaters of war, like the ship-bound Void Butchers. Their differences even extend to the way they do battle, as not all World Eaters charge screaming into melee combat. The Bloodstalkers are known and often derided by their fellow World Eaters for their patience and gunnery, yet they reason that a warrior who lives longer claims more skulls for Khorne. The 66th Armored Company have become one with their vehicles and bulldoze through enemy positions safe within armored hulls. With the World Eaters largely reunited behind their Primarch, Angron promises to become an active participant in the Great Game and present an entirely new threat to the Imperium in the era Indomitus. Karn, when still the captain of the 8th Assault Company of the Warhounds, was struck by his first sight of his Primarch's visage, a description which still rings down the millennia. Wiry, copper-red hair curled away from a high brow. Pale eyes sat deep behind cheekbones that angled down like axe strokes to an aquiline nose and a broad, thin-lipped mouth. It was the face of a general to follow unto death, the face of a teacher at whose feet the wise would fight to sit, the face of a king made for the adoration of worlds, the face of a Primarch. And rage made it the face of a beast. Rage pulsed and distorted the features like a tumor breaking out from the skull beneath. It made the eyes into yellow, empty pits, debased the proud lines of brow and jaw, peeled the lips back from the teeth. According to the custom of the Nucerian gladiators he was raised among, Angron cut scars into his torso after each of his battles, in a continuing length known as the Triumph Rope. For every victory, the scar would be left to heal normally, while for every defeat, the warrior would work some dirt into the wound and cause the scar to turn black. Angron was the only gladiator in Nucerian history to possess no black scars. Corvus Corax believed that no other Primarch could have bested Angron in single combat, save for Horus and perhaps Sanguinius. Leman Russ was often considered Angron's equal in physical combat. Rogel Dorn, on the other hand, believed that he could defeat Angron easily through the use of strategy and acumen, and feared him much less as an adversary than he did Horus, who was a strategic genius. Before being implanted with the Butcher's Nails, Angron displayed an inherent psychic ability which allowed him to not only feel, but also somehow absorb the pain and negative emotions of others. He used this empathic power to calm the other child slaves in the caves of Nuceria before he was taken to the city of Deshia.